Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Wes and the Historian. Today, I'm back in the dorm, and I'm sure some of you have noticed that the microphone which I just got is already, I forgot it at home. So, anyway, I just want to immediately start off and start talking about something which has been interesting me recently, and that is Greek and Germanic mythology, or more specifically, Apollo and Odin, and kind of bridging the gap between them, because something that's quite interesting is that it's very common for people to want to make comparisons between different uh, religions, especially when it comes to paganism. Um, but one thing which people have noticed is that it's a little harder to do that with Germanic paganism because in Greco-Roman mythology, you have a dedicated war god, you have a dedicated healer god, you have a dedicated sky god, whatever else. But in Germanic mythology, the lines are a little blurry, and everyone is kind of a war god in some way, shape, or form. And the chief god is not really like a sky god in the same way that Zeus is, and the sky god is more Thor, who isn't really like a paternal sky father figure, but he's still a sky god, and he's kind of the main sky god in Germanic mythology. So, something which is interesting is that if you ever read Tacitus, he describes the Germanic god that they worship the most, the chief god, as Mercury or Hermes. So he equates Odin with Hermes or Mercury, which I always thought was a very weird comparison, and it makes some sense because both are associated with kind of delivering messages, but specifically delivering the dead. They're both kind of have like a death god quality to them. Um, but still, I think the comparison is a little odd because that's not really Odin's chief role. Odin can be chiefly understood as a god of death, a god of war, and honestly a god of poetry. I would say he's a god of poetry and writing in the runes and prophecy. So those are the qualities I would associate with Odin. And another god, which I think a lot of I've seen comparisons to, is Dionysus, because Odin's name quite literally means frenzy, and when you think of a god in Greco-Roman paganism who is associated with frenzy, it would probably be Dionysus. The cult of Dionysus were known to drink a sort of wine that would make people go into a frenzy and then, tear people apart or something, just go crazy and like run wild. But I also do not totally think that comparison is great. And honestly, if I were to give any comparison, I would compare Apollo and Odin. I think that they are probably the closest in a lot of different ways. I think it's interesting, Apollo, we probably don't seem to understand this, but the Greeks seem to venerate Apollo very much so, to the extent that people often will call Apollo the most Greek of the Greek gods. He's associated with youth and with energy, and he was a popular, muse of the most popular figure when it comes to statues and worship. People seem to venerate him, and the most important qualities are kind of shared by both him and Odin. And I will get into even more qualities, but more specifically, Apollo is seen as a god of the hunt and war. We see this especially in the Iliad. I mean, it opens with Apollo raining arrows down. So although many people wouldn't think of Apollo as a war god, I think it would make sense to consider him sort of like a deity of war. And of course, he's not so much a war god as Athena or Ares might be, but I still think it would be appropriate appropriate to attribute those qualities to him, especially because he's kind of alongside Artemis, a chief archer god. The god of archers, the god of archery. And alongside that, he's also a god of poetry and music. And that's a quality which is shared by Odin. So, Odin is not the only god of poetry in Germanic mythology. One thing which we need to understand is that gods are not very simple categories. You don't just go, this god is a god of this god is a god of that, it's not that neat. A lot of, in paganism, and you see this as well in Hinduism, a lot of polytheistic religions, people will take a god that they personally feel drawn to, and they will focus on the qualities they like about that god, and that's why, one god can get multiple attributes. So that's why in Germanic mythology, you see like 3 different gods that are all seen as kind of chief gods, or all seen as poetry gods, or death gods, or whatever. It's because certain families, certain tribes, certain chieftains go, I really like that god, and I like that they're this is a quality of them. So I'm going to write a bunch of poems celebrating that aspect of the god. And then historians go, all right, well, all of these gods seem to be heavily associated with this because certain families do this. And the same was true for the Greeks, because the Greeks would set up a home altar and they would venerate a certain god, and they would venerate it for its specific his or her specific qualities that they really like. And that's why in Hinduism you don't really say that there's a god of this, a god of that, because certain families who practice Hinduism feel drawn to certain gods, and they focus on the attributes of those gods that they like. And that's just how it is. That's how polytheism works. So I think we do have to understand this going forward. But with all of that being said, I am going to keep going on why I think Apollo and Odin are probably the most similar. Another thing about Apollo and Odin, so I already mentioned this, both are gods of music and poetry. Odin hung himself and received the runes, and his mead, which is a sort of alcohol with that's uses honey, is associated with being able to write good poetry. And that's a very common theme in Germanic and Norse paganism, is that Odin's mead is seen as this kind of like spiritual gift to poets. Poets see Odin as their god, and they receive the ability to write good poetry directly from Odin. And bad poets also receive the ability to write bad poetry from Odin, but in a very different way and from a very different part of the body. But anyway, moving on, I think it's also interesting how, in some ways, Apollo, and this also goes into the whole war god thing, Apollo has attributes of a death god, or a god of death, and also a god of healing and a god of disease, because his name quite literally means destroyer. He, was known to be kind of ruthless. I mean, read the Iliad, but he, he was a very ruthless god, and just very ruthless god. He was known to give disease or to take disease away. He was known to cause death. When he was a child, he killed a snake. He was pretty ruthless, and a snake that was sent to kill him. So he killed a snake as a little baby. But he, just incredibly ruthless and destroyer god. And yeah, he has that in common with Odin, who, that's probably one of the more common things people attribute to him, is that he will oversee battlefields and just randomly decide, all right, that guy would do so well during Ragnarok. I want him dead right now. And He would just pluck him from the battlefield, and by that I mean he would have him killed in some way, and then he would pluck his soul from the battlefield and have him fight for him in Valhalla and whatnot. Um, so I think that attribute is very similar. Another thing is actual appearance. So when we think of Odin, we think old man with a beard and he's missing an eye. However, the very first depiction of Odin in ever was as a young man. He was depicted as a young man. I don't know how it turned into old man. I assume it's because of him being like a father figure god. There are theories that he originally wasn't the father figure, the chief god. I don't believe that, but a lot of people do. But the original depiction of Odin was as a young man. He looked more like Apollo than many others would, than how we understand him. But Apollo, of course, I think if you've ever seen a statue of Apollo or a painting, you know what he's supposed to look like. He's like the epitome of male beauty. He's a little effeminate in some ways. He's like a metrosexual man. He's like dainty and elegant and handsome and muscular. He's like the very, very stereotypical handsome young man. And yeah, he's a god of youth. He's a god of sport. So those are important attributes to Apollo. And of course, like how we understand Odin as this old man with a beard and missing an eye. Not to say that that depiction is invalid or I would ignore that depiction, but it wasn't the original depiction, and we know that because the earliest depiction of Odin was found on a gold coin, and he was depicted as a young man. So there you go. And he wasn't even missing an eye. But yeah. So those are some of the big things. But some of the interesting kind of random things is that both gods are also associated with owls, or not owls, ravens. Ravens. Those are like the bird associated with the god, and also wolves. Apollo is known as a wolf killer. I don't remember the story why, but he's known as a wolf killer. But they're both associated with wolves and ravens, and if I recall correctly, also snakes. I don't remember the story behind why Odin is associated with snakes, but Apollo founded the Oracle of Delphi at the corpse of the snake that he killed when he was a baby. So, there you go. But anyway, I don't actually think I have anything else to add. If anyone would like to leave any comments adding things, that would be much appreciated. This wasn't like a really formal video. I just wanted to talk about something that's been interesting me because it was on my mind. I thought it would be cool to talk about. So anyway, thank you for watching, and goodbye.